In the aftermath of the Amaris coup, confusion reigned across the Star League. The Terran Hegemony was under heavy assault, though everyone beyond its borders was in the dark about this. The surgical strikes against the HBG stations and the capture of all system jump points prevented word of Operation Apotheosis getting out, giving the Rimworld's aggressors the vital time they needed to eliminate the few pockets of resistance. In the previous chapter, we looked at the first day of the battle for Terra, but similar attacks began at H-hour across the hegemony. By the end of 2766, the Rimworld's army had moved to occupy over half of the castles Brian within the realm, which put them in a very strong position before the first shot was even fired. Add to this the many friendly governments and nobility who were eager to switch sides. It's not surprising the RWA were able to secure 95 worlds within the first 24 hours. Not all would go down without a fight, however, particularly those housing sizable SLDF garrisons. General Scoffins had identified many of those who would prove more stubborn ahead of time, and assigned a larger complement of troops to tackle the problem. In most cases, it was just a matter of time. However, there were several unexpected stumbling blocks along the way. One of those where things had gone awry was Davion. The heads up from space had given Major General Anika Telman time to seal the castle's Brian ahead of H-hour. As one of the Star League Defense Force's 5 regional HQs, this was a major problem for the RWA. Another world where the capture of the HBG had been thwarted was CAF. The SLDF commandos fought for almost a day before they were ordered to stand down by Duchess Misha Confalanieri, an Amaris sympathizer. They withdrew into the wilderness rather than surrender. New Dallas was one of the few outright victories for the SLDF. Having failed to capture the HBG intact, General Bembardo had withdrawn what was left of the 62nd Republican Guard Brigade into Fort Resolute and called in 8 RWM warships overhead to provide assistance. Unfortunately for them, the SLDF had also secured the SDS stations, and the Navy soon found themselves fighting for their lives against the many defense drones. On the ground, Major General Carlos Cataga launched an offensive, ultimately routing the Periphery forces. Bembardo was killed in the battle, her dragoons fighting to the last man. Within 6 hours, New Dallas was secure, but it had come at a heavy cost. Carver 5 saw intense fighting between the two sides. The main SLDF stronghold was the Quantico Island Fortress, training center for all Can Marine forces within the regular army. As H-hour approached, the small Rimworld's aerospace complement based at Quantico began launch procedures. They were grounded at the last moment when Colonel Koji Icho, the base's space traffic control manager, noticed a rapidly approaching squadron of RWA fighters on radar. Knowing full well that their allied pilots were equipped with nuclear weapons and had every intention of dropping them on the base, the Rimworld's fighters began lining up for takeoff regardless. This triggered a bizarre skirmish between the aerospace pilots on both sides, where landed or taxiing craft engaged each other on the ground, as did the handful of mechs present. The Star League won the engagement and raced to intercept the approaching bogies. Sadly, a number broke through, and in the opening minutes of the coup, 4 nuclear detonations rocked the island and the city. They failed to eliminate the fortified base, however. Over the next few days, General Sol van de Kolk's Can Marines secured Quantico, whereas his counterpart, General Noriko Milton Davis, took control of the rest of the planet's many island continents. This standoff would ultimately last into the next decade. The elimination of SLDF High Command was a priority target for the RWA. Director of Special Forces Command Koji Telasco had been visiting Sabik when the coup began. Despite nuclear strikes on the Harsh Terrain Test Center and the Special Armed Services Training Center, the SAS forces survived. Telasco led his commandos to victory against the invaders in just a few days. But as the general closed in for the kill, the RWA looted the supply depots, destroyed the HBG and all jump ships in system, and then left, ensuring that those on Sabik were trapped. While Telasco may have survived the coup, he could no longer challenge Amaris. Though he saved the lives of many on the ground, he would eventually succumb to radiation poisoning in the coming years. The Rimworlders undertook a similar strategy at Sirius, merely raiding the mining colony of its valuable materials, blasting the orbital stations into oblivion, and leaving the survivors to fend for themselves on the volcanic surface. Back in orbit over Terra, the SLN succeeded in launching a precision strike against the last RimWorld's warship in orbit. They had less than a day to celebrate this victory, however, as Amaris began to consolidate his remaining fleet assets within the Terran system above Earth. Late on the 29th, they launched an assault against the Met's orbital defense station, and the last of the SLN presence was destroyed. Ultimately, only 4 of the warships Amaris deployed to Terra survived APOTHEOSIS, all heavily damaged.
Amaris' victory on Terra was near absolute, achieved through years of careful planning by his officers and soldiers. But in the days following the coup, Amaris became aware just how tenuous his hold over the planet was. With so many of his warships needed to secure the jump points along the hegemony border, the space battle over Earth had been won only by the narrowest of margins. Of the 84 Star League warships that were within the hegemony during the attack, 31 had escaped to unknown systems. Were they to suddenly materialize in orbit, they would create a blockade around Terra Amaris would be unable to break. Unfortunately for the SLDF, it would take too long for the isolated survivors to regroup, by which time Amaris had brought online enough of the Regan SDS to secure his holdings. Were it not for the complete takeover of the HPG communications network, it's possible that the fabled Star League Civil War would have lasted less than a month.
The capture of the Ian Cameron shipyards allowed them to bring the craft there into active duty, and over time another few hundred of the more serviceable craft from the reserve fleet were pressed into action, replacing most of their losses, albeit with old and inferior designs. Other naval yards were secured quickly during the coup, though they would have some trouble with the massive Omicron II facility at Keed, when the workers on board decoupled the various wings and arms and sent them cartwheeling into space. By December 30th, 135 planets within the hegemony were now under RimWorld's control. Amaris broadcasted a message to the conquered worlds. In it, he downplayed the hostilities and pushed the idea that he had liberated them from the oppression of House Cameron. Stefan had grand plans for the hegemony, and winning their support was vital. While Amaris and his schemers were working to alter the face of the inner sphere, General Scoffins set about surgically crushing the remaining opposition. Some were relatively easy to deal with, such as the resistance on Bryant. They had used their storm inhibitor array as a defensive weapon to pin down RimWorld's troops and damaged naval units. The destruction of these colossal orbital mirrors brought a swift end to proceedings in early January. The defense of Northwind fell not to the SLDF, but to the 5 Highlander mercenary regiments. Because they had not been involved in the Periphery uprising, the planet was one of the most heavily defended at the time of the coup. Scoffins had accounted for this in advance, deploying a large contingent of forces which crushed the Northwind Highlanders within the first week. Meanwhile, the SLS Dreadnought, which had been steadily jumping towards Lyran space, was intercepted at Wyatt in mid-January. The ancient warship made a heroic last stand to buy time for the civilian vessels to make their final jump into the Commonwealth, though the ship with which McKenna had forged the hegemony some 450 years earlier was lost with all hands. The commandos on CAF had resurfaced after a few days and begun a guerrilla campaign against the occupiers. This ended quickly when Colonel Orestes Tomasevi disabled the energy barriers keeping the planet's dinosaur wildlife away from the civilian population, in retribution for harbouring the SLDF. On the 27th of January, the Colonel reported to Amaris that the world was secure, though in reality the commandos were just in hiding. New Dallas, which had survived the initial assaults, now faced a new threat when Admiral Otto Idowu aboard the RWS Tiger Shark arrived in system. He moved his 30-warship flotilla from the jump points into orbit, destroying the last of the world's STS on January 14th. He gave the planet 24 hours to surrender. Governor Titus Clay and Major General Kataga ordered their aerospace assets to fight, but it proved a futile gesture. The orbital bombardments began the next day and continued unabated for 16 days until fresh RimWorld's troops arrived on the 31st, by which time Kataga and his New Dallas Rangers were annihilated within Fort Goliad. But even the execution of Governor Clay didn't completely eradicate the guerrilla resistance, and New Dallas would continue on as a thorn in the RWA's side. The troublesome Castles Bryan were Scoffin's primary targets during this period. The Sandhurst base was effectively isolated when RWA reinforcements redeployed to Britain and surrounded the complex, occupying the base by the end of the month. This relatively bloodless victory was the exception though. around the same time, the survivors at the War Academy on Mars were overwhelmed after 6 weeks of bitter fighting. The 141st Amaris Dragoons, who had been besieging Mount Baker, were reassigned to CAF. That world had been declared for Amaris on the first day, but the 3378th and the 3381st Special Forces battalions continued to fight. The 118th Dragoons and Salazar's Irregulars had been unable to locate the battalions, but the arrival of the 141st helped eliminate the majority of the SAS. The few survivors went on to found the planet's large resistance movement. The 5 Army Group headquarters worlds each possessed at least one Castle Bryan still under SLDF control, as did half a dozen others. Successive nuclear and orbital strikes over the course of several months finally cracked these facilities and cemented Amaris' rule. Likewise, the bases at Mount Baker and Sverdlovsk were overcome in this manner. Only Kathmandu's construction deep underground prevented a similar fate, and incredibly, would continue to resist for over a year. The destruction of these last bases marked the end of First Corps. A mere 8% of the premier First Army had survived the Periphery Uprising and Amaris coup, and most of those fell the following year. All ground resistance from this point on was in the form of partisan and irregular units, sometimes led by former SLDF officers. Achieving this victory had come at a not insignificant cost to the Rimworld's army. More than 50 regiments had been destroyed, about a quarter of their strength. Furthermore, their navy had been reduced to less than half its former size.
An essential part of Amaris' plans to capture the Terran Hegemony was taking control of the space lanes. To do this, he would need to construct the largest fleet of any house save the Star League Navy itself. Those ships built by the Rimworld's Republic were put together so rapidly that quality control fell by the wayside, many entering service with all manner of defects. He cajoled Richard Cameron into allowing him to crew over 100 of the mothballed reserve fleet while secretly acquiring the codes to launch 100 more moments before the coup. At a time when the member states were each fielding around 50 vessels, with as many older craft being mothballed, Amaris made his move with a fleet of well over 300, 4 times as many warships as the Star League had on hand. Yet despite this advantage, the dogged defense of the SLN coupled with losses sustained to the space defense systems resulted in the destruction of more than half of his armada. The worst casualties were suffered at Terra, including the loss of all 3 brand new Stefan Amaris-class battleships, along with the head of the Rimworld's Navy, Admiral Geoffrey Cotier. Stefan dispatched urgent messages back to the Rimworld's Republic to hurry completion of the next 2 hulls in the class, RWS Gregory and Terran's Amaris.
Also targeted during Operation Apotheosis were the shared planets along the border of the hegemony. RWA troops deployed to each and were able to eliminate the small member state garrisons. The exception to this was Tikhonov, where Hamilton's Highlanders and Justinia's Cuirassiers fought doggedly to hold on to the key industrial world and commonality capital. These conquests were one of the very few occasions that the Rimworlders faced off against a foe other than the SLDF. Amaris intended to return full control to the other realms, as a reward for acknowledging him as the new leader of the Star League. The near-complete subjugation of the realm did not mark the end of the Star League's operations within the hegemony though. In late January, SLS Kharkov and Wales reached the hidden deep space facility in the Lyran 6828 system, known only to the most senior admirals. There, the directors of JAG and RepDep Command met the Deputy Director of Naval Command, Admiral Vincenzo McTiernan. The existence of this base remained a closely guarded secret throughout the war, but it would become the center of resistance efforts within the hegemony. The surviving members of High Command ordered the deconstruction and reassembly of several recharge and refueling stations, including the Apollo 4 shipyards, to a pair of uncolonized systems. Known as Freedom and Liberty Stations, they were havens for those fleeing the war, as well as staging posts for the so-called secret fleet. One of the most pressing concerns for the Rimworlders was that so far only 6 of the space defense systems were under their control, and one had been completely destroyed at New Dallas during the coup. They needed a way to reinforce their shattered fleet and stop the secret fleet from operating within the hegemony. While the SLDF was still frozen out in the periphery, the RWA struck first at the Lyran worlds of Nusakan and Zabeb-el-Ganubi. The two planets were a contentious issue between the Commonwealth and the Hegemony, a shared ownership arrangement having never been established. Officially, they belonged to House Steiner, but the strong Star League presence meant that in reality they answered to the Camerons. Both had been instrumental in the development of the SDS. An SLDF battlemech division was stationed within the 3 Castles Bryan of Nusakan. 2 of those facilities came under surprise assault and were overrun in the weeks following the coup. Fort Romas fought on throughout 2767, but was eventually overwhelmed. Thousands of officers were dispatched to the Allsop Robotics headquarters on Zabebel Ganubi to train in the operation of SDSs, though bringing them online was a long, slow process. Amaris' primary concern in January 2767 was legitimizing his hostile takeover of the hegemony. Many planetary governors and nobility had given their support, some willingly, others through bribes or coercion, but he needed similar approval from the common citizens. Most were as unenthusiastic about Cameron as the upper classes, but feared new leadership under the usurper. The Rimwell's president's public image during this period was carefully crafted by Samir and Jari to belay those fears. Stefan played on the dislike of the Cameron family and claimed that the SLDF was trying to restore that ignominious house to power. He also promised an increase in cooperation between realms, something that had fallen off sharply in recent years. Lastly, he made demonstrations out of those individuals within the RWA who had brought about civilian casualties, often as justification to remove problem officers, such as General Tolston Yukai, who was replaced as military governor on Davion by January 10th and publicly executed on the 28th.
Despite the grandiose name given to the Rim world's Operation Apotheosis, Stefan Amaris didn't see himself as a god. It was more of an inside joke that started within his inner circle that eventually became real. But if he was a god, he was a generous one, at least as far as his own military was concerned. In the months following the coup, those units that had performed well were greatly rewarded. The 4th Amaris Dragoons had achieved victory over the Royal Black Watch and were expanded into a full brigade, now back under the command of Colonel Zat Dag, following Armstrong Duquette's self-imposed nuclear injury. Likewise, the Green Haven Gestapo, whose timely arrival had won the day at Geneva, were also expanded. However, those who had not pleased him soon found themselves facing down the barrel of a gun. Rimworld's Army General Tolston Yukai, the man Amaris' own propaganda was now calling the Butcher of Dairon, became a scapegoat for all the overzealous commanders who had created more carnage than Stefan found tolerable. Of course, the death toll mattered far less to Amaris than the damage to his political optics.
To win lasting support though, Amaris chose to hold an election that would decide the next Director General. The usurper needed to ensure that the outcome of this democratic vote went in his favour. His primary opponent during the election campaign was Count Frederick Oldenhoff, President of the Terran Congress, a man carefully chosen as having little public appeal. Others who stepped forward were soon given reasons to withdraw from the running. The main concern was any Cameron claimants to the throne. As per the Star League Accord signed 2 centuries earlier, only a member of House Cameron could serve as First Lord. As long as that family remained, they would provide a rallying point for opposition. Amaris didn't flinch from the only solution to this problem. Most of the royal family had been at Unity City for the Christmas celebrations and were now prisoners. Over the next few weeks, others were rounded up from across the hegemony until 79 were being held prisoner at the court of the Star League. The city itself had been further marred by several cataclysmic landslides. The nuclear fire had charred the surrounding hills to bare black earth, and when the torrential rain started days later, a third of the city had been swept away, killing thousands more. The rain continued for weeks, a lament for the dead First Lord. On January 21st, the Camerons were gathered in the throne room and presented with Amaris' demands. Renounce their family name and swear fealty, or refuse and be executed. First to step forward was Elise Graham, Richard's wife. She carried their daughter Amanda in her arms. Elise refused and told Amaris he would need to kill them both. Inspired by her defiance, many more refused, including Richard's sisters, Elizabeth and Helena, the latter of whom was also rumoured to be pregnant. The 21st to step forward, Jason Cameron Bashina, was the first to kneel. At that moment, Stefan Amaris revealed his true sadistic nature. He drew the laser pistol with which he had killed Richard and shot Jason dead. Realising their fate was sealed regardless, the family attempted to rush the throne, but were gunned down by Stefan's guards. In the aftermath of the throne room massacre, Amaris ordered the chamber sealed, a tomb for the once mighty Great House. All this, of course, was hidden from the public. It was said that the Cameron family had accepted exile and left the hegemony. The pragmatic worldview of the neo-chivalristic state actually accepted this, understanding that Amaris could never allow them to remain to press their claim. Though the First Lord's fate remained a mystery for the moment, in time, stories were told about Richard's refusal to step down, about it was he who drew the weapon and attempted to kill Amaris before being overpowered and shot by the Rimworld's president. That title would soon prove to be an afterthought to Stefan Amaris. On January 28th, approximately 70% of the voting populace elected him as the 21st Director General of the Terran Hegemony, the first non-Cameron since James McKenna. This was confirmed 2 days later by the Hegemony government with a majority of 63%, the necessary backing whipped up by his ally Philippa Dante. In exchange for her fervent support, the Terran Congress presidency passed from Count Oldenhoff to herself. The fact that less than 10% of the electorate had voted mattered little to the end result. All the evidence that pointed to tampering with the election was swiftly swept under the rug by the BSLA, an organisation that was de facto controlled by Amaris' ally Outerbridge.
The democratic election held for the hegemony's next Director General is an interesting historical point. Exactly how much credence should be placed in it? A violent military takeover had taken place just 1 month earlier and was still taking place on some worlds, and yet now people were expected to go out and vote. Their choice of candidates was also severely restricted. Somji Berku, a member of the Terran High Council, withdrew after accusations of embezzlement, the irony being that no man alive was as guilty of said crime as Stefan Amaris. Another counselor, Atrisha Kisabaka, gracefully dropped out of the running to focus on her family, the same family which Amaris' goons had just thrown in an African gulag. Jens Pinera, the Director General during Simon Cameron's reign and throughout his son Richard's regency, wanted nothing to do with the new government and retired into obscurity. Terra also had a rocky history with democracies in general, the ancient Terran alliance having nearly resulted in another world war before James McKenna stepped in to forcefully resolve the situation. And yet, despite all this blatant manipulation, it cannot be denied that Amaris had significant support among the hegemony's people and had a realistic chance of being elected anyway.
On January 31st, the time had come to reveal to the galaxy what had transpired. Amaris issued an address to the hegemony and wider inner sphere, proclaiming the dawn of a new era. Sidestepping the legal issue of the Star League Accords, which he knew his opponents would use against him, Stefan boldly overcame the problem by declaring the formation of a new interstellar state, the Amaris Empire. This was the first message to leave the core worlds since the HBG blackout. It quickly propagated across all known space and sent tidal waves through the political and economic spheres. Shock would be a tremendous understatement in describing how this announcement was received. The leaders of the member and territorial states, who each received a personal message in the days after, were dumbfounded by the sudden usurpation. Each was commanded to recognize Amaris as their new emperor. None did. The man who took it the hardest was coordinator Takiro Kurita. The emperor's message revealed that his grandnephew Drago and his family were alive and well, and hostages in all but name. Takiro was distraught at this news and fretted constantly for several days. Soon after, he collapsed. On his deathbed, he made his son Minoru swear that he would work peacefully with Amaris to ensure Drago's safe return. Takiro died aged 121. The SLDF at large was still fighting against the Periphery uprising, but their advance soon ground to a halt once the Star League banks defaulted on their payments. The news reached Commanding General Alexander Kerensky on February 4th. Some reports say the general was so stunned that he shut down completely. He seemed disbelieving at first and requested confirmation from those close to home. Nobody sent into the hegemony returned. The Chevalier stepped in meantime and ordered all SLDF HPG traffic be rerouted around the hegemony to prevent interception by Amaris. New ciphers were dispatched by Kurita, but this put a pause on all operations until they were delivered. The SLN's 12th Fleet was dispatched to their old stations in the Rimworlds to begin gathering intelligence on how much of the RWA remained, and by extension, how much had been deployed to the hegemony. The loss of the prime communications circuit, a network of more powerful relays that used the hegemony as its central hub, was a significant blow to their operations. Only the actions of Jerome Blake, now de facto head of the Department of Communications, made it possible for the remaining HPGs to handle the increased workload.
Any discussion of Jerome Blake's activities during the Star League Civil War risks conflating the man he was then to the man he would become. There's not a soul alive in the 31st century who has not heard of ComStar's sainted founder. Back in 2767, though, he was merely a Chief Technical Operations Officer for the HPG on Oliver. Born and raised near the Great Lakes in North America, Blake demonstrated himself to be a technical savant in his childhood. At the age of 16, he graduated from the University of Lambrecht with a degree in hyperspatial mathematics and applied physics. When Amaris launched his coup, Jerome was away vacationing in the Free Worlds League. By the time the dust had settled, it was discovered that he was the most senior member of the Star League Bureau of Communications to escape from the Terran Hegemony lockdown. Tasked with establishing alternate routes for HPG communications around the compromised Terran Hegemony, Blake's amazing success at the task won him instant approval among the SLDF, as well as endearing him to the Council Lords who were suffering their own disruption from the Amaris takeover.
A ceasefire was called for on all fronts in February, something that the retreating Periphery forces were glad for. The SLDF waited to see what Kerensky would do, as did the Council Lords, who asked the Commanding General to declare his intentions. One of the most significant effects of the Amaris coup was the near collapse of the Innisphere economy. The damage caused by the HPG blackout cannot be overstated. Across all the realms, businesses were in crisis. With no trade going in or out of the hegemony, even those nations who had spent the past decades distancing themselves from the League were hit hard. Trade between member states kept the better prepared afloat, but nobody escaped unscathed. As the economic freefall continued, it created a situation where the use of arms to seize raw materials became almost a necessity. Fear of SLDF retribution was the only thing that kept the State Lords from launching massive raids against their neighbours to claim resources for themselves. Neither the Star League nor Amaris Empire was in any position to police such actions, of course. Come February, they were both in ruinous financial situations and were racing to secure new funding. One source of wealth for Amaris was the seizure of the enormous fortunes of the Vatican Church. Under the command of General Legos, the Greenhaven Gestapo arrested the Pope after he refused to sell out his fellow cardinals. Other religious groups were similarly persecuted. In time, Antelos would make Italy his personal fief. Another two of Amaris' priority targets during the coup had been the capture of the Talitha and Zolokofan exchanges and mints. These would go some way to repaying those companies that had helped finance the secret army. Many businesses were becoming increasingly tied to the new government, sometimes unwillingly, with the success or failure of Amaris' takeover going on to mirror their own fate. They soon found themselves in a situation where their continual support was the only way to remain afloat. To withdraw it risked the assets being seized in order to cover the government's debts. Most of the nobility and business elite were still happily on board, however, their concerns assuaged by Aisling Connor. Once communications were re-established with the outside world, BSLA Director Ueno ordered the state administrators to begin sending all Star League revenues back towards Earth. The administrators stood opposed to this and refused, but many others at lower levels of government, including the directors of the Narellan and Preston exchanges, followed through with Ueno's request. This resulted in the already badly damaged BSLA fracturing down the middle. The situation worsened when the heavy-handed SLDF response came in April. Hundreds of officials were arrested for simply following the orders of their new Director General. This in turn led many more to side with the Amaris Empire. Thankfully for Kerensky, the vestiges of the loyal Cameron government supported him, and he was able to secure some funding from them. The collection of taxes from the member and territorial states, though, was going to be a more contentious issue. He could safely rule out any support from the Periphery, who had left the Star League in all but name. The tenuous ceasefire was not even 10 weeks old at this point. In the end, none of the Council Lords opposed him, though John Davion was the only one who offered anything more than indifferent approval at this early stage.
Amaris' decision to seize the border worlds under joint member state Star League administration is perhaps one of his biggest mistakes from the early days of the war. However he wished to couch the proposed handover back to their true home nations, the fact that it was essentially ransom didn't go unnoticed. Realistically, none of the Council Lords were ever likely to acknowledge him as the new head of the Star League, or the authority of the Amaris Empire over them. And so the takeover of the worlds within their own territory predisposed the Lords to treat Amaris as a threat. While much has been said about the lack of aid Kerensky received from the member states, the fact remains that they offered the Empire even less. While the subsequent invasion of the Commonwealth worlds had some strategic importance, the gravest mistake was in trying to capture the commonality capital of Tikhonov. The Capellans already had one regional capital under foreign occupation in the form of Chesterton. They would have never tolerated another, and the attack risked open war. Later events would show that the Empire was never able to fully exploit the worlds within the Terran Hegemony. Adding another 20 systems to the Empire required garrisoning in exchange for little in the way of resources, and the guaranteed animosity of his neighbors. This was a poor trade.
The former Rimworld's army had not been idle during this period. Reformed into the Amaris Empire Armed Forces in the immediate aftermath of the coup, under the now commanding general Patrick Scoffins, he had begun by organising the core of his military into the Imperial Liberation Army, with the remainder of his 24 divisions split into the 1st and 2nd Liberation Armies. Those few troops left behind within their home nation would continue to operate as a 4th Rimworld's army. Amaris ordered Scoffins to recruit fresh troops directly from the hegemony. Their goal was to raise 30 new divisions all told. Long term, the Empire could rely on the many military academies within the hegemony now under their control to supply them with loyal and well-trained soldiers, but they needed a short-term stopgap. The Hegemony Patriot volunteer units were their answer, the first of which began their training under the Hector O Imperial Division on April 1st, 2767. Several existing units, such as the Mexican Legion that had participated in the coup against the SLDF, now freely joined the AEAF, and they expanded to a full brigade. In addition to the new commanding general, Amaris promoted several others within his inner circle to high positions. His uncle Peter Amaris became Minister for Education, Aisling Connor was the new Director of Economic Development, and Samir Anjari took on the role of Amaris Empire Minister for Media. Unofficially, the latter two had a brief relationship, and it was suspected that Samir was the father of Aisling's daughter Efi. Anjari would also become the overall head of the Cryptia, working to expand its influence into the Terran Hegemony. On May 19th, Kerensky received a personal message from Amaris himself. In it, the now Emperor gloated his victory over the Camerons, and threatened Alexander with destruction should he rise against him. The fate of Richard Cameron was still kept a secret, as were the events of the Throne Room Massacre, but the commanding general understood that there was little to no chance that the First Lord was still alive. Amaris made one critical misstep though. He offered Kerensky a chance to prove his loyalty and confirm his place as a trusted ally. All he need do was subjugate the rebellious territorial states. This betrayal shocked his supposed allies in the Periphery and revealed to them Amaris' schemes. Kerensky's response came on the 22nd. He addressed the member and territorial states, announced an end to all ongoing SLDF operations, and declared war on the Amaris Empire. In the days that followed, Kerensky met with Magistrix Janina Centrella and President Alice Avalar, while he dispatched his deputy to treat with Protector Nicoletta Calderon, a person he could no longer stand to face. Amaris' actions had already become known as the Great Betrayal in the Periphery, and they were willing to accept an official ceasefire, signed on the 24th of May. The Freedom War had been won. The same day Kerensky had received the message from Amaris, the Epsilon Indi Division had deserted en masse. They saw that their namesake planet was under threat and could no longer tolerate inaction. Together with the 568th Armed Transport Flotilla, they turned and headed for home. the commanding general understood that he could delay no longer, and on the 29th issued orders for all SLDF armies within the Periphery to redeploy to points Epsilon and Kappa within the Lyran Commonwealth. The Star League Defense Force was going to war.
Hey Amaris, MacCat here. I just want to let you know that there was a guy back in the 20th century who would be a great case study as to why everything you just did is going to come back to punch you in the mouth. Except that mouth punch has a name. Chadazander Kerensky, Supreme General of the Star League Defense Force, Alexander Kerensky.
Alright guys, that's it for this episode, a little bit shorter than the last few, but hopefully it still scratched that itch for you. Thank you to those guys who participated and lent their voices to this project, and thank you all for your patience. It's been a little bit longer than I would have liked between episodes. However, the good news is I have already completed a first draft of chapters 6 and 7. If all goes according to plan, we'll be back next Saturday where Kerensky and the Star League Defense Force are going to go on the offensive.